All right, so picture you're in London during World War II, and you've lived through the Blitz, those nightly bombing raids from the Germans, and you've gotten to a point where you can even recognize the sound of the V-1 Doodlebug, um, those flying bombs, and just when you think things can't get any worse,
Yeah.
there's a new terror, a new kind of horror arrives,
Hmm.
an explosion, seemingly out of nowhere, no warning, just a deafening roar and total devastation.
Right. This was the V2 rocket.
Yeah,
And
it was a weapon so advanced for its time that it was actually the first man-made object to reach space.
Exactly. And, you sent us some really amazing source material on this. An excerpt from Dan Snow's History Hit podcast with Murray Barber, the historian who practically wrote the book on the V2.
He did.
So we're going to really dive into the development of the V2, its impact and its legacy, which is pretty surprising when you think about it.
Yeah, and it's a story full of contradictions.
Mhm.
On the one hand, you have technological brilliance, but on the other, it's intertwined with some of the darkest chapters of human history. Yeah, definitely.
And it raises some really interesting questions like, was the V2 just a desperate attempt by the Germans to change the course of World War II?
Mm.
Or did it actually speed up their defeat? And how did this Nazi terror weapon ultimately end up paving the way for space exploration and so much of the technology that we rely on today?
It's pretty mind-blowing.
It is.
So let's start by kind of setting the stage.
Okay.
It's September 8th, 1944. Just typical day in London.
Right.
And all of a sudden, a V-2 rocket slams into Chiswick.
Wow.
And there's no warning, no sound. It just hits and leaves this crater like 20 feet wide where houses once stood.
Yeah.
And this was the world's very first introduction to ballistic missile warfare.
Yeah, and I think it was that element of surprise that made the V2 so terrifying, right? Unlike the V1, which you could hear coming, the V2 traveled faster than the speed of sound, so you had no warning, no time to react, no time to take cover.
So let's break down these V weapons a little bit because we have the source material mentioning not just the V1 and V2, but there's also a V3 and a V4. So were all of these actually operational weapons?
Well, the V1, as you said, was essentially a cruise missile, a kind of unmanned aircraft with a pulse jet engine.
Right.
It was relatively slow and it could be shot down,
Mm-hmm.
but it still caused a lot of damage and definitely a lot of terror.
Of course.
The V2, though, was a completely different beast.
Right.
This was a ballistic missile, meaning it was launched on a trajectory that took it way up high into the atmosphere before it came back down on its target.
And the source material mentions it reached heights of over 60 miles. I mean, essentially touching the edge of space, right?
It did, yeah. And that must have been an incredible feat back then.
Absolutely. I mean, the V2 was a technological marvel.
Mm.
It stood over 46 feet tall, carried a 1-ton warhead,
Yeah.
and it could reach speeds of over 3,500 miles an hour.
That's fast.
And yeah, you're right. It was the first man-made object to cross that boundary into space,
Yeah.
which is both impressive and, when you think about its purpose, pretty unsettling.
Yeah, definitely.
So what about these V3 and V4 weapons? What were those all about?
So the V3 and V4, they were more conceptual, more ambitious projects that never really panned out.
Okay.
The V3 was a supergun.
A super gun.
Yeah, it was designed to basically bombard London from across the channel.
Oh, wow.
And the V4 was supposed to be a long-range ballistic missile, but neither of them were ever actually deployed.
Okay, so they never actually saw action.
No.
It's kind of fascinating to think about the role of the Treaty of Versailles,
Yeah.
in the development of the V2, because you'd think that it would have stifled any kind of German military innovation.
Right.
But it seems like it actually had the opposite effect.
Well, yeah, the treaty, which was signed after World War I, put very strict limits on Germany's military, but it didn't specifically mention rocketry.
Hmm.
So this oversight, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but it created a loophole, and German scientists and engineers, they were quick to exploit it.
So they saw an opportunity and they just ran with it.
Exactly.
And that's where figures like General Dorberger and Wernher von Braun come in. Right?
Precisely. Dorberger was a military leader with a lot of vision, and he saw the potential of rocketry.
And von Braun was the brains behind it all.
Yeah, he was a brilliant, albeit controversial engineer, and he was really the technical mastermind behind the V2. And of course, he later played a key role in the American space program.
Right.
But, his work for the Nazi regime is a dark mark on his legacy for sure.
For sure. Speaking of the development of the V2, I'm just curious, were there any major technical challenges that they faced? Because for a weapon that was so ahead of its time, you have to wonder if they hit any roadblocks along the way.
Yeah, what's surprising is that one of the biggest limitations wasn't actually the technology itself.
Right.
It was the lack of good maps. Yeah, to hit a target hundreds of miles away, you need incredibly accurate maps, and the Germans simply didn't have that level of detail for London.
Hmm.
So that impacted the accuracy of the V2.
That's wild. So they had this groundbreaking rocket technology, but they were still held back by something as basic as accurate maps.
It's true, it just goes to show you that even the most advanced technologies can be limited by things that we might take for granted.
That's a good point.
Now, they did try to improve the accuracy. They used a radio guidance system called Lightstrahl,
Okay.
but it was a complex system, and kind of ironically, it was brought into an SS unit that wasn't as skilled as the regular Army rocket crews.
Oh, so you're saying there were some internal politics and rivalries at play as well.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I can't imagine this weapon was cheap to produce either, right?
You're right, the V2 program was a huge drain on resources. In fact, the source material that we have compares the cost of a single V2 rocket to that of a heavy bomber, like a B-17.
Oh, wow.
It was a significant investment for a weapon with, questionable strategic value.
Yeah, I can see that being a point of contention, for sure.
And that really begs the question, did the V2 program actually help or hinder the German war effort? Was it a game changer or just a desperate gamble that completely backfired?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine it really turning the tide of the war at that point,
Right.
But what about the overall impact?
Well, the V2 definitely had a psychological impact.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the sheer terror of those silent, deadly missiles just raining down on London can't be overstated.
Yeah.
And initially, the British government actually tried to cover up the V2 strikes.
Really?
They told people they were gas main explosions to avoid panicking the public and to keep the enemy from realizing how effective the weapon actually was.
Wow, that's a pretty crazy detail.
Yeah.
So they were really trying to downplay it.
Yeah, they were.
But in terms of actual damage, did the V2 really live up to all the hype?
Well, the numbers paint an interesting picture here.
Okay.
While thousands of V1s and V2s were launched, only a relatively small percentage actually hit London. The V1s, because they were slower and easier to intercept, actually caused more casualties overall.
That makes sense.
But the V2, with its speed and unpredictable trajectory, instilled a far deeper sense of fear and helplessness in people.
So it seems like the psychological impact was the real weapon here, more so than the actual physical destruction.
Exactly. And some historians argue that the resources that were poured into the V weapons program could have been used more effectively elsewhere.
Oh, interesting.
Imagine if those funds and manpower had been diverted to developing other technologies like the Me-262 jet fighter,
Oh, right, the jet fighter.
which was also ahead of its time but faced production delays because of a lack of resources.
Yeah, I see your point. So you're saying the V2 might have actually weakened Germany's overall war effort because they pulled resources from potentially more effective projects.
Yeah, it's definitely a compelling argument, and it raises the question of whether the V weapons program was just a big strategic blunder. Maybe it was a last-ditch effort to just terrorize the enemy rather than a real path to victory.
That's a pretty chilling thought that this technological marvel that was born out of desperation might have actually helped lead to Germany's defeat. But I guess the story doesn't end there, does it?
No, not at all.
What happened to the V2 technology and the people who created it after the war?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated after the war. The Allies, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, were in a race to get their hands on German technology and expertise.
Oh, yeah. Makes it.
And the V2, with its advanced rocketry, was a very sought-after prize.
So this weapon that was created by the Nazi regime became a key piece in the Cold War rivalry.
Exactly, and a clandestine program called Operation Paperclip was launched to recruit German scientists and engineers, including Wernher von Braun, the mastermind behind the V2.
Wow.
They were offered positions in the U.S., and their past affiliations were often overlooked in the name of national security and scientific advancement.
That's wild to think about. These scientists who were working for the enemy just months earlier were now helping to shape the future of American rocketry. It really speaks to the complex realities of war.
It does, and the ethical implications of Operation Paperclip are still debated today.
Yeah, I bet.
Some people argue that it was a necessary evil, a pragmatic decision in a world that was on the verge of another global conflict.
Right.
But others question the morality of using the knowledge and skills of people who were complicit in the horrors of the Nazi regime.
Yeah, that's a tough one for sure. So what happened to Wernher von Braun? Did he continue working on rockets for the Americans?
He did, and his work had a major impact on the American space program.
Okay.
One of the most significant early developments was the Redstone rocket, which was basically a scaled-up V2 using a lot of the same design principles and technologies.
Wow, so the V-2, this weapon of terror, indirectly laid the foundation for the rockets that would eventually take Americans to space. That's a strange twist of fate.
It is. The V2's legacy is full of contradictions. You know, it's a story of technological brilliance fueled by a dark ideology, innovation, mixed with human suffering. And it really highlights how scientific advancements can be repurposed and reshaped over time.
And it makes you think about the nature of progress itself. Is it always a force for good, or can it be a double-edged sword capable of both creation and destruction?
Yeah.
It really does make you think about how progress isn't always a straight line,
Yeah.
you know?
Right.
And speaking of progress, the V2 wasn't just a weapon, it was also a stepping stone to space exploration, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. In the years after the war captured, V2 rockets were used in all sorts of scientific experiments.
A whole lot.
They launched instruments and even animals into the upper atmosphere.
So these weapons of war were used to gather scientific data and pave the way for future space flights.
Exactly. It was a time of intense scientific curiosity. And the V2, despite where it came from, it provided a platform for exploration that had never existed before. It helped scientists to study cosmic rays, atmospheric conditions, and even how living organisms behaved in a near space environment.
It's just amazing to think that these rockets that were designed to cause terror and destruction were then repurposed to help us understand the universe better. It really shows how adaptable technology can be and how history can take these unexpected turns.
It really does. And that brings us back to Wernher von Braun.
Yeah.
His story really embodies this complex relationship between science, politics, and morality.
Yeah. He dreamed of space travel, but his path to achieving that dream was definitely paved with compromises and moral ambiguities.
For sure.
I mean, his involvement in the Nazi V2 program is undeniable, but he also played a huge role in the American space program, which culminated in the Apollo moon landing. So how do we reconcile these two sides of his legacy?
It's a question that historians and ethicists are still debating today.
Yeah, I bet.
Some people argue that his contributions to science are more important than his past. They say his wartime work was driven by a desire to advance rocketry, not by Nazi ideology. But others believe that his involvement in a regime that was responsible for such horrific crimes cannot be excused.
It's tough because there isn't an easy answer.
Right.
It's a reminder that even the most groundbreaking scientific achievements often come with complex ethical questions, and there isn't always a clear-cut right or wrong answer.
You got it. And it's important to remember that the story of the V2 isn't just some historical anecdote. It has lessons for us today as we enter an era of really unprecedented technological advancement with AI, genetic engineering, and other fields that are rapidly changing. We have to be mindful of the ethical implications of these innovations.
That's a good point. We need to be asking ourselves some tough questions like, who benefits from this technology? Who might be harmed by it? What are the potential long-term consequences?
Yeah, these are questions we need to be asking all the time, not just about rockets and weapons, but about every new technology that comes along.
Absolutely. The V2 is a powerful reminder that technological progress, while it can be beneficial, isn't inherently good or evil. It's up to us as a society to guide its development and make sure it's used responsibly, ethically, and for the good of humanity.
Well said.
Well, if this deep dive into the V2 rocket has given you something to think about, or if you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. You can find us on our website or social media. And if you want to explore more fascinating historical events and how they relate to the world today, don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.